Saturday, July 20th, 2019, Maneco 64, home of alternative economics and contrarian views. Today I want to cover geopolitics, what's going on between the West, especially the United States, the UK, and Iran, and why I think all this is a engineered crisis or a non-crisis. And I'll reference this book, The Energy Non Crisis by Lindsay Williams as well. And I'll look at some articles in the LA Times, an article in The Guardian, to put my case across to you. This morning I got up quite early. I drove to the shop. We needed some milk. I usually walk there, but it was raining, so I drove. And all the newspapers are talking about this Iranian situation, especially with the fact, due to the fact that Iran captured a UK flag, British flag ship yesterday in the Strait of Hormuz. They also captured another ship which had British flag, but they let it go. So there's a big build-up now. There's a lot of talk of conflict with Iran. And why would they want to engineer a crisis? Well, in my opinion, it's a psychological operation on the general public to make people, how can I say, think differently. Like to make people accept hardship and decisions that they would normally not accept from the powers that be. That's what I think it's all about. So before I go into why I think this might be happening now with Iran, we need to go back in time. And I'm going to look first at Lindsay Williams' book, which I highly recommend, The Energy Non Crisis. Then I'll look at an op-ed from a couple of years ago in the LA Times about the October surprise, which is what the crisis, the Iranian hostage crisis of almost 40 years ago was called. And I'll look at an article in The Guardian talking about the current crisis in the Gulf, Persian Gulf. I'll start with this book then on chapter 3. And this is about the oil embargo that the Saudis implemented, OPEC oil embargo in 1973. I still remember that. I remember that period. I was about 8 or 9, and we saw in the news all the cars lining up or queuing up in the United States and everywhere else around the world. There wasn't enough oil out there or gasoline or petrol, and the price zoomed, the price of oil. And we were told, the general public was told, it is because the Saudis and the Arab countries were upset about the I think it was the 1973 Israeli war. That's what it was about, right? But reading this book will change your perspective about that. So I'll go to chapter 3, and it's entitled, Shut Down That Pipeline. So I'll quote Lindsay Williams. I have already said that the first time I realized there was no true energy crisis was when the senator from Colorado visited me in Alaska. However, like many other Americans, I had heard the rumors and hearsay many times before that. In fact, I first became aware of the supposed energy crisis in 1972. And don't forget, the energy crisis only started in 1973. When I was riding on Roundup in Wheatland, Wyoming, on a 32,000-acre ranch. That day, as we rode into high country looking for cattle, I noticed a big pump. It was, in fact, a large pipeline that was running across the Rockies. I was curious. That is my nature. I said to the man with me, "Sir, what is the big pipeline running across your property?" I should explain that because I am a Baptist preacher. I am often called Brother Lindsay. I suppose it's a courtesy title. My friend answered, well, Brother Lindsay, that's one of the major cross-country pipelines carrying crude oil from the west to the east. Ah, I answered, that's rather interesting. I've heard there's a possibility of an energy crisis. I'm sure glad those pumps are running full speed ahead. That was in 1972. You remember that 1973 was the first time we were told there was really an energy crisis. The East Coast was used as a test for that energy crisis, and there were long lines of people waiting, burning fuel while they waited in line for gas they couldn't get. In 1974, I was again in Wyoming and went to the same ranch. I remember that fall as we rode round up over the Rockies. I saw something that startled me. I had just come from the East Coast where I had numerous speaking engagements, and with the rest of America. I had been told we needed to conserve energy, for if we didn't, we were going to run out of fuel. Crude oil was in low supply and natural gas would soon become a scarce commodity. Imagine my surprise that fall as we rode back over that same high country to find that the big pump was closed down. The pipeline didn't seem to be running. As we rode the high country on horseback, I asked the gentleman who managed the ranch, "Sir, why isn't that big pump running?" "You don't mean to tell me that they have closed down a major cross-country pipeline?" Back on the East Coast, I have seen people standing in line on fuel. What's the story? Well, that old Westerner said, Brother Lindsay, here a few months ago, they came through and started to close down that pipeline. And you know, that thing went right across my property, and I believe I had a right to know why they closed it. After all, I received money from the oil that was flowing through the line across my property. And so I went up to the man and asked him why they were closing down the pipeline. I said to them, don't you know that on the East Coast, where that oil is supposed to be going, they have an energy crisis? Don't you know that there are people waiting in line to get fuel, and we've got an energy crisis? Men, why are you closing the line down? I listened intently, for I was vaguely wondering if this pointed to some sort of manipulation for a purpose that was unknown to me. The old Westerner went on. Well, they didn't want to tell me, Brother Lindsay. You know how we Westerners can get sometimes. Cowboys are known for being a little bit mean and ornery. And I decided to use some of that orneriness and persuade that man to tell me why he was closing that pipeline down. So I went up to the boss man and got a little bit rough with him. I told him I wanted to know why that pipeline was being closed down, because after all, it was going across my property. I let him know that I was an honest American and that I had thought that back on the East Coast, they were having an energy crisis, even though we had plenty of fuel out west. Well, the man finally recognized that I was getting a little bit indignant, and he said, well, mister, if you really want to know the truth is the federal government has ordered us to close this pipeline down. The old Westerner went on and told how he stood up to the boss man. Why, man, I can't hardly believe that. After all, we've got an energy crisis. The boss man answered him, sir, we're closing down because we've been ordered to. So there you go. So was that really an energy crisis? And why would they want to drive the price of oil up? Well, I think it has all to do with the petrodollar. Don't forget, 1973, the dollar had been off gold for a couple of years. They also the system of fixed exchange rates went floating in 1973. And they had to create demand for the dollar, or else the dollar wouldn't stay as the reserve currency of the world. So I'm sure this crisis was engineered with the cooperation of the US government, the Saudis. They were all in it together. We are told, the general public, that it was the Arabs, the Saudis, that embargoed because of the Arab-Israeli war. But there's more to it, right? So what does the high price of oil do? Well, it creates demand for dollars. But how can you do that when there isn't a crisis? Let the price of oil go up like that? People would be very upset. There could be even a revolution, right? And I'm sure a lot of people were upset, but they didn't have a choice. It was those Arabs out in the Middle East with their embargo, right? So for the Iranian hostage crisis, which I think was kind of a non-crisis as well and was engineered by the powers that be, U.S. federal government, the Iranian revolutionary government as well. I'll go to this LA Times op-ed entitled "Some October Surprise Conspiracies Turn Out to Be True." So this is by Kai Bird, and I'll quote Mr. Bird here in this op-ed. "We Americans love conspiracies. They are like good spy stories, entertaining, intriguing, and tantalizing. But historians learn to hate conspiracy stories. The evidence is often circular, circumstantial, and infuriatingly slippery. And usually the simplest explanation, not the conspiracy theory, turns out to be the best." In my first biography, The Chairman, John J. McCloy and the Making of the American Establishment, about the influential Wall Street lawyer and perennial presidential advisor, I had to write about President Kennedy's assassination. McCloy had been a member of the Warren Commission charged with investigating the assassination. Early in the commission's deliberations, another member, Alan Dulles, passed around copies of a 10-year-old book about 7 previous attempts on lives of various presidents. The author's thesis was that would-be presidential assassins typically are misfits and loners and not part of any conspiracy. Dulles observed, "You find a pattern running through here that I think we'll find in this present case," McCloy quickly retorted. The Lincoln assassination was a plot. I don't know what President Trump and his minions were saying to the Russians before or after the November election. But it is true that foreigners routinely try to influence American elections. Democrats in particular have painful memories of the '68 October surprise in which Republican presidential candidate Richard Nixon passed messages to the South Vietnamese president, Nguyen Van Thu, telling him to stall the peace talks. Nixon always denied the allegation, but we now know from the private diary of H.R. Haldeman, Nixon's chief of staff, recently discovered by the presidential historian John Farrell, that Nixon was lying. And then there was the alleged October surprise of 1980. The Reagan administration and Republicans always denied that they had any backdoor negotiations with Ayatollah Khomeini's revolutionary regime during the Iran hostage crisis. Specifically, they denied that Reagan's campaign manager, William J. Casey, traveled surreptitiously to Madrid in the summer of 1980 to meet with a representative of the Ayatollah and to suggest that it might be in Iran's interest to stall the negotiations over the release of the American hostages. Casey allegedly intimated that a Reagan administration would resume arms sales to the Iranians. These allegations seemed too outrageous, too outlandish to be believed. Journalists investigated. A House October Surprise Task Force delved into the story. 2 good books, Gary Sigg's October Surprise 1992 and Robert Parry's Trick or Treason 1993, made strong circumstantial arguments that something had happened, though neither were able to prove that Casey had flown to Madrid. And this is where it gets interesting. But just a few years ago, Parry discovered a damning memo in the George Herbert Walker Bush Presidential Library, dated November 4th, 1991. The memo was written by President Bush's Deputy Counsel Paul Beach, and it described the State Department's effort to collect documents in response to congressional subpoenas for material potentially relevant to the October surprise allegations. Beach then specifically mentions a cable from the Madrid embassy indicating that Bill Casey was in town for purposes unknown. So we now know that Casey took time off from his campaign duties sometime in the summer of 1980 to visit Madrid for purposes unknown. That's all we know. There is a 1991 White House memo about a State Department cable that was presumably dated in 1980. We do not know if Casey went to Madrid with the knowledge of his candidate. Indeed, from what we know about Casey's love for intrigue and even skullduggery, this former spy and veteran of the World War II era Office of Strategic Services, OSS, may have initiated his own backdoor channel to the Iranians without any authorization from Reagan. But I think it is now reasonable to conclude that Casey did something. The Iranians dragged out the negotiations over the release of the hostages. President Carter believed these negotiations were nearly successful in late September 1980, but suddenly new demands were made that stalled the talks. Polls showed Carter within single digits of catching Reagan until about 10 days before the election. Carter lost decisively, and the hostages were inexplicably released minutes after Reagan was sworn in as president. So that was January 20th. So that's very interesting. I mean, this is not proven, but it is kind of suspect. All the papers in the UK, of course, are talking about what happened yesterday. The British flagship was seized by the Iranians. We don't know where it is. FT says UK warns Iran is on dangerous path after tanker seizure. But I'll also go to another story. It's from the Guardian. It says Gulf crisis. Story began with UK seizure of Iranian flagship in Gibraltar. So yeah, earlier this month, the Royal Marines also seized an Iranian flagship, Grace 1 in Gibraltar. So this is not unexpected that the Iranians have basically responded by seizing a British flagship, the Stena Impero it's called. So why do I think this could be an engineered crisis? Well, if you go back to the late 70s, the US dollar was in trouble. I know they had the petrodollar already up and running, but there are stories about how the US Treasury even started, I'm not sure if they started thinking about, but they actually were selling treasuries denominated in Swiss francs. I think the dollar index bottomed somewhere in 77, 78. Gold was starting to rise. It was at $400 an ounce. I think before the Iranian crisis, it had been at 35 prior to Nixon closing the gold window, of course. The oil crisis or non-crisis. So I think the oil embargo crisis, the energy non-crisis, as Lindsey William calls it, and the Iranian hostage crisis, they were just cover for the inflationary collapse that we had in the US. Don't forget, there was a really bad recession in the early 80s, and the dollar was on its last legs. And those crises kind of covered why the US dollar is in trouble. I think you need to go back to early 60s, throughout the 60s and early 70s, to see why we had the rising prices and the inflation. Well, it was because of the the guns and butter policy started by Lyndon Johnson and continued by Richard Nixon. Deficit spending, that's what it was all about. So they had to like put the spotlight on the Arabs, those guys, those Arabs. They embargoed, they're greedy, but we weren't told that the U.S. government, Henry Kissinger, they were working together with those Arabs. And they're the same people that the U.S. administration still works with today. The Saudis, right? It was the Saudis when I mean Arabs. So what about today? What's the crisis? Well, the crisis is that we've had 11 years almost of unconventional money printing, QE, zero interest rates, negative interest rates, and we've got nothing to show for it, and the system is ready to implode, in my opinion, and they need a cover. What best cover than Iran and the crisis, maybe a war in the Persian Gulf, and blame everything on that war and bring the system down. Yeah, it's psychological. Take the attention away from the real culprits, which the real culprits, of course, are the people in charge, the bankers, the politicians, the deep state, not only in the US, but the UK and Europe. So this is my opinion. I've gone back to in history and looked at other crises and what has happened during those crises. I've given you a few examples. It's up to you to decide whether you buy into this. So to conclude, I think basically they're trying to engineer a huge crisis. It could become a war, and they will use that war to clean up the system. The game is up, and they need to clear the table, and they have to have an excuse to do it. They need a crisis to do it. They can't just do it when things are just going okay, because people would be asking, why are you doing this? So they have to make it so people accept it. That's my opinion. Please comment below if you think it's all hogwash what I've said. Comment below if you think you agree with me. I like to see comments either way so that we can have a debate and a discussion. So if you enjoyed this video, make sure you hit the like button, share it far and wide as well, and you can also follow me on Twitter, Steemit, and on DTube. I wish you all a great weekend. Take care. Bye.